Oh, well, I was just going to project and use my theater training. There we go. Hello, anybody who's watching online. So this is new for us in that we are producing a world premiere of a play. This is a play that has never been performed on its feet in front of an audience before. So that's really exciting. It's new for us because this will be the first time that we've performed a play on the Albert Lee campus. And it's also new for us because this will be the first time that we have had the playwright who wrote the play here in residence on campus working with us and with our students, our cast, and our faculty as they have worked to put together this production. So it's been really exciting for us. Just a reminder that the play itself, Wilson's Girl, opens this Friday. It will be over in the Austin West building. So for those of you who are really used to coming to our theater, don't go to the theater. This is, again, something also another different thing that we're doing. It's not being performed in the theater. It'll be over in the Austin West building cafeteria. And that will be 3 performances this Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And then next weekend, we will be on the Albert Lee campus in their commons, also Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And there are still tickets available, so if anyone has any questions about how to do that, you can come talk to me afterwards. So thank you again for joining us today, and without any further ado, I'd like to present the playwright, Miss Eva Barr.
Hello. I want to say first and foremost that I'm thoroughly honored to be here. So while it's a new experience for these folks to work with a first-time playwright, it's incredibly exciting to be able to put this play up in the very counties in which the activities happened. I will be honest, I would have liked to start in Albert Lee because it was, the strike that it's about happened right there in Albert Lee, but goodness gracious, we're about as close as we can be. So I want to thank Susan Hansen for towing the line and really diving into it with as much gusto as any one human being can in a collapse short of time. It's been a wonder to watch it be on its feet and to watch someone else work with some words that I've arranged. Now, I'm being called a playwright here, but in fact, I'm an adapter. I've started with a text and I've arranged it. And this comes from a tradition that I would link back to the theater company that I founded way back in '88, coming out of Northwestern University. A number of us who had worked together in our acting classes decided we were going to take an approach to text that was physicalized and poetic and start our own theater company. 30 years later, that company is thriving and doing very well in Chicago. I spent about 28 years working with Looking Glass. Looking Glass produced it's called Looking Glass Theater Company. That came out of the first piece that was done was Alice. And so it was actually not an original take on Alice, but it was a restaging of a Manhattan Project piece that was done in New York. And then we went on to do an original version of Through the Looking Glass that I was involved with in '88. In any case, that's a bit of history to the approach that I chose to take to this text because I've had more experience in adapting text. That is not to say that we don't also write original works, and I will talk a little bit more about the original works that I've written in southeastern Minnesota. But first of all, I'm not really a lecture artist. I much prefer to dialogue, and I would really love to open the floor to any and all interruptions. I feel like I've got a room full of people here from whom I can learn, and I love to exploit that opportunity. So if you have something to add, please raise your hand or draw me out on anything that I'm going to talk about. We're going to largely focus on the process of coming to what this piece is, first on the page, and then what it is becoming on its feet, and where the piece stands, as it were, right now. But I know that each of you came here for a reason, and maybe it's a personal reason, maybe you're just curious, but maybe you write on your own. And I would dearly love to know how many writers we have out there. And when I say write, that doesn't mean, I'm using it in a broad sense of the term. Perhaps you are a storyteller and you don't write anything down. Perhaps you are interested in passing stories on to a next generation, and so you tell stories at bedtime. How many of you consider yourselves storytellers of sorts? Okay, great. So maybe today some of you will be awakened to telling and passing stories. I think it's really important in our society today to consider who is telling stories, what stories are told, how are they telling stories, who has access to being able to tell the stories that shape us today, have shaped us in the past, and may shape us into the future. So a lot of, what is pressing for me being a rural Minnesotan, and we'll talk about how the author's own journey, and when I say the author, I'm referring to Sherry Register, who's the historian whose book I've adapted, Packing House Daughter, about Albert Lee. She left Albert Lee, and that's something that we explore in the book. She decided that her life needed to take her on an intellectual journey away from her hometown, and then there were reasons why she never returned. I, too, left Albert Lee, and I thought that I was going to get the education that I needed for the theater, and in fact did in Chicago, as it were. So she and I were both at endpoints. She was at University of Chicago, I was at Northwestern University. That commonality is some of what drew me into working on this book. We both had very different upbringings in Albert Lee, and I'll talk about that some. But I think that the choice to come back to place is a really interesting one for Midwest rural America. I would say that we are in a rural crisis for losing population and having to ask the questions about what keeps a town alive and vital. And so for me, I'm interested in those stories that force us to deal with those difficult questions about vibrant communities, about inclusive communities. What are the issues that are keeping people there and thriving, and what are the issues that are perhaps preventing people from staying and thriving? And I think many of them hinge on questions of race and class. And these are issues that are alluded to and underpinning Sherry's book. And when I decided to adapt for a contemporary audience, this book was about 20 years old, I thought, what are going to be the important questions to put on stage for an audience today? Hoping, of course, this was 2 years ago when I started. Fascinating what one presidency can do to our public dialogue, right? But I think, given a number of issues which have come up in the packing industry and in the, in the labor world, even in the last month, I couldn't be more confident that the stories that Sherry is talking about and framing, the conversations she's framing, are as relevant as can be today. So I would like to, so this is a theater piece. How many of you have experience in the theater? How many of you like to go to see a play? Okay, great. Can anyone be so brave as to say why? What is it about? Let's say, okay, how many of you like movies? Okay. How many of you would choose a play over a movie? Okay, anybody want to tell me why? I've got to stay here. Sorry. I will repeat what you say because it's all being recorded right here. Who? Yeah.
Because of the live experience.
Okay, and what about the live experience excites you or it draws you in?
I think it makes it more authentic and real.
Authentic and real. Okay. Can I dive deeper? How?
I think it's easier to connect with the actors in the story because it is a live experience.
Easier to connect with the actors in the story because it's a live experience. Okay, yes.
It's raw.
It's raw. Okay. Raw how?
As in, like, with movies, you have editing and, like, take 1, 2, 3, but when you have a play, there's obviously rehearsal, but there's the play for the opening for that night. That's your one time.
Okay.
It's raw, it's emotional, it can be connecting, it's just...
Okay. So there's a production element that happens with movies that sure may happen with a play, but in that moment of exchange, it's a one-time experience. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Paraphrasing? Okay, great. How about you? Okay. He feels he's more able to understand the message. By virtue of what? Because it's a body in front of you, as opposed to sort of a flat screen, potentially? It's live. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Any other thoughts? Yes?
As an audience, I have more control. What I watch, what I see, I have this spectacle and this panoramic view that I myself adjust rather than somebody fitting me in a production like a movie.
Very interesting. So he says he has more control as an audience member to affect the experience overall. Okay? Yes?
Well, the audience is part of the production.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the energy between the audience and the performers.
Okay. So it's an energetic exchange that draws you. Yeah.
The true talent that you see, Wicked, for
Okay.
example,
Great.
to watch someone perform the songs and the choreography and see such talent that they can do. TV's make-believe. Theater is real.
Ooh. TV is make-believe, theater is real. How nice. What a provocative statement. That's good. Okay, great. So on that, we can sort of chew on that. That's some fun stuff to think about. So I'm going to get to the process that I chose to design for adapting this piece, but I just wanted to give a little bit of my own personal history so you can understand where I'm coming from. So I grew up in Albert Lea, decided I wanted to be a theater artist and research schools, and Northwestern was the one that sort of called me. There was something about Chicago. I had relatives there that always drew me in. So I got in and went, started this theater company, Looking Glass Theater Company, and worked with the company for 2 years, the first very formative years, and then found myself to be restless on stage. I felt like I was up there presuming to, even in our, edgy kind of form, felt like I was presuming to know something that the people out there didn't know. And I felt like, gosh, I just don't know enough about the world and how it works. So I left the company for 5 years and went back to school, studied world issues, economics, anything that provoked my intellect. And then I traveled and decided, actually I joined the Peace Corps, but that's a longer story. I won't get into that. But out of that, decided that I needed to learn to farm because I wanted to have a life that was self-sustaining. And so I met a fellow on the way, and we learned to farm, and that road brought us back to southeastern Minnesota, where there's fertile land and beautiful landscape. And so now we farm outside of Wyckoff. At the same time, I couldn't put to rest my love for theatrical works and involvement therein. So I rekindled my relationship with Looking Glass and worked on a project basis. So I was back and forth between here and there, which is really an interesting way to not only work, but to raise my kids. And we homeschooled them, so they came. And but that allowed me to have a certain perspective, not only on the world of performance production, but how a city works versus how a country works. And I feel like in the last 30 years, we've definitely been witnessing, this drain out of the countryside. And, we can talk about what economic forces are driving that. But it is concerning because I feel like our rural places are so rich and inviting and have so much potential that I hate to see people think that they have to move away to get whatever, if they think it's culture or money. Money often drives that. Can't take care of yourselves unless you've got a well-paying job in a city. So that's a longer subject, but one which I think that this piece of Sherry's invariably forces us to consider, what are the jobs that are secure and help make a thriving community or environment, home life even. Looking Glass did that, came back here, found, well, I would like to tell stories of people among whom I live. What are the stories that are burning to be told here? And of course, we know everybody has a story. Everybody's life is filled with drama, like it as we may not. There may be too much drama for us in our lives. But I also think every life is legendary. Certainly those of us, we're all involved in tight relationships and realize that the people in our lives hold value. Those people with whom we are closest hold more value than any celebrity or person in the canon of history may hold. So to me, I started with staging stories of my mother and her three friends, 370-plus women in Albert Lea, whose lives were foundational to the communities in which they live. But these were women who signed their checks, my mother in her case, Mrs. Lowell Barr. And, for 30 years was always that person's shadow. And so I was so enriched by working with those women and their stories. I went on to work with some people in Wyckoff, some people in Spring Valley, and I've done other sort of documentary pieces because I feel like there are just so many stories from which we can learn that are as exciting to watch physically as are, Ibsen and Shakespeare and any of those other great authors. So in that time, around 2004, I had read Sherry Register's book, and as a kid, growing up in Albert Lea, I knew nothing of the Register family, nor that she was a historian. She did not write this book until 2001, so it was long past the time that I had been in Albert Lea. But it was such a beautiful memoir about the streets that I grew up walking, the places that I grew up visiting, that I thought, this book will sit with me for a while. And indeed, in the course of the next number of years of raising kids and doing other performance work, it did. But come 2017, I was like, I think it's time to stage a book about a union family. And that's at the core of this book, especially when we're looking at the big talk, when our president came into his position now, was how divided the country was. And Sherry talks a lot about how divided her community was at the time of this strike. And so I thought, I wonder, first of all, How many of you have been to Albert Lee? Okay. How many of you know where the Wilson's plant used to be? Okay, so only a few of you. So when you drive into Albert Lee, there's a big bridge that kind of leads into what, is still downtown, but yeah, there are all debates about where the center of town is. But there's a big open field with a big real estate sign on it right underneath this bridge, and that's where the plant was. And now it's just a big open expanse. And for almost 20 years, there's been no ability to make appreciable value of that land, right? So I thought, gosh, how many high school kids today even know what used to be in that space? Because if you grow up today, how would you know unless there were stories that were passed on, right? Furthermore, I started thinking about, well, how many kids, have grown up in rural towns that were really economically thriving, which seems to be sort of a lost concept for a lot of us. How do we keep a business? It's always, how can I keep this business afloat in my town? So I thought I would love to work with some high school kids and see how interesting this book might be to them. Like, is anything in it interesting? When you write for the stage, of course, you want it to be relevant to people who live today, right? That they can somehow relate. And so I felt like, well, I'd like to work on it, but I certainly want to be certain that it's going to mean something to someone. So I spoke with a few teachers, one of which was a humanities teacher who teaches history at Albert Lee High School, and he said, I have always thought there needed to be more stories about the Wilson's plant. When he came to Albert Lee, it was still, it was kind of in its last legs. And what about the Wilson's plant was noteworthy was it created a smell that pervaded the town, right? So any newcomer was struck instantly by the presence of Wilson's. And he said, I've as objectionable as that smell may have been, I linked it with Albert Lee and with a kind of vibrancy or activity that seemed quintessential. And it's fascinating to me that is no longer here, and we have really no way, or at least with our students, to engage about that part of our history. So I asked if he had ever thought about teaching this book, and he hadn't. He had not even read it himself. He knew that it existed. So that was fascinating to me, because in fact, ultimately when I did meet with Sherry, who I'll talk about in just a minute, she said people are using this book in universities all across the nation to talk about working class issues. But in the very town in which the events happened, there was no one yet who was teaching this book. So I got this fire under me, and I thought, okay, I'm going to work with this teacher, and we're going to work with the students, and we're going to talk about the subject matter, and we're going to write a play that will be performable. So I took the steps to get a grant through the Minnesota State Arts Board. But first and foremost, I contacted Sherry Register to be certain that she was interested in this kind of thing happening with her work, and she was thrilled. She was, hadn't really thought about, well, she had thought about it being a potentially nice play. But she had never been approached by anyone for it to be adapted. And she thought, well, it's about time, and how great that you want to work in my hometown, and yes, I'm on board. Let's do this. So I wrote the grant. We got some funding through the state, and I designed a residency that would allow me to spend some time with the students, introducing, as it ended up, the teacher who signed off on this was not able to reconfigure his curriculum in time for them to read the entire book before we did our work. So we took the chapters that had potentially the most stuff for good conversation and discussed those. And then we invited Sherry in for a day of interviews. And I have a section of video I'd love to share with you of her talking with the students, which I'll do in a minute. And then I spent, those first 2 months, while I was in Albert Lea, I interviewed countless people who had worked at the plant, who knew anything about Wilson's operations in the 50s, but then also people who were in the business community in Albert Lea in the 50s to get a variety of sides of the story. Now, I'll tell you, when you come upon a story and you want to consider it, of course, there are going to be myriad viewpoints, and you're going to, in this case, try to mine out or tease out perspective on the issue so that you can get a well-rounded understanding. So I really wanted to have people who had felt forced to be those who crossed the picket line, to be on our panel, to speak with the students. And I found very quickly, when I began to explore who might be willing or even still alive, first of all, because it happened in '59, there weren't a lot of people still around. So that was the first issue. But then those who are willing to open up and share stories that, interestingly, are still very charged with controversy, became a little bit more challenging. If you, at one point in your life, feel that you have to make a potentially ethical compromise in order to be able to feed your family, it's hard to put that conflict to rest. So I will say I interviewed people who still harbored really strong resentments, to the people they knew who had made the decision to cross the picket line, and B, to those who they felt whose power forced them to make that kind of compromising decision. Can I ask here, how many of you have been involved in any labor dispute or strike situation? Okay, would you give any insight to what your experience is? Or
It was.
Thank you for being.
It was a conflict as far as those who were on one side of it and those who were, in a sense, forced to go across the line into work because of the nature of their position.
Mm-hmm.
And there was so much emotion attached to that with people that you work with every day.
Right.
And it was heavily charged at the time, and it was difficult. There was a strike here at the college.
Okay.
Our faculty were on strike. And, actually, it was Nathan Absmead was on strike. Yeah, and the faculty had been on strike at a previous time. Right. So, yeah.
But I think, and so for me, the question is, how is it that a strike situation brings on emotion, a kind of emotion that in some ways is paralyzing, or limits one's ability to speak reasonably anymore? And we talked about this in the classroom. And what was fascinating with these high school students is they were so removed from work situations of allegiance that the only way that we could really approximate feelings of affinity were to talk in terms of teams or in some cases cliques, but of course cliques is really problematic because I don't think it's almost a pejorative term. Because even if you are one of the in crowd, you're very aware of the effect that it potentially has to an exclusive effect on others. But in a culture in which less than, at this point, 12% of our workforce is associated with a union, it's challenging for young people to think in terms of, solidarity for keeping a job, right? At the time at which the Wilson strike happened, the country had more like 40% union membership. So that's a radical, radical difference. In the 50s, late 30s into the early 60s was a heyday of unionized labor. And in fact, I don't know how many Austin people know this, but there was a period in the 30s that almost 90% of Austin workers downtown were unionized. There was a union called the International Union of All Workers that was born here. And there were, people who waited tables, cab drivers, people who worked in banks, like everybody was involved to secure their jobs through a union organization. And that union then influenced other movements in Albert Lea and the region. So it was fascinating to me to hear from these young people when working with them in the high school how foreign some of these concepts were. So there was a certain amount of consciousness raising and awareness raising in the classroom that had to happen. So in fact, we spent a week, well, not a week, a couple days, allowing them to organize the classroom around issues that were important to them. So then there was the group that was interested in good food in the cafeteria. There was the group that was interested in, having extra vacation during, they were all very, during MEA, and those who wanted better tech, and whatever. But they were organizing around things that were important to them in the school. And so they had their interest groups, and then they had to go through exercises about how they would expand their membership, how would they put forward their ideas, who were the sources of power that would possibly pose barriers to their accomplishing their goals. And so going through these exercises, they began to see, what it means to form a sense of solidarity around issues that are important to individuals. So that was part of the residency to allow them to sort of get into the essential conflict, which is a strike about issues well beyond wages. I think the wages were just one element, a penny raise, but mostly it was safety in the workplace, health care, and seniority terms. That happened in 1959 at Wilson's. So I thought that I would show some of the pictures of students engaging with Sherry in the classroom, and I would talk about some of the things that came up for them. And then I can talk a little more about the process of adapting the script, because there were certainly questions that came up in that. But let's look at these first pictures, and then we'll go back to them. Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to push this. Yeah. Oh, I guess I have to stay here, don't I? So we did the residency. We did interviews in the classroom. We had panelists come, and unfortunately I don't have any pictures of the panelists, but we had panelists who, so here's Sherry Register talking with me in one of the classrooms. There were 3 classes of about 25 students each. There's a closer up of Sherry. This is Jim Haney, the teacher, who always wanted to expand on things that arose. And these are the classes at the end of the event. So, for them, knowing where to start with Sherry, a lot of them, it really resonated for them, the fact that she didn't come back to Albert Lea, right? And many of them dream of, getting out, which is kind of a rural theme. And she talked about how, and I have a video clip that I'll show later, that she really thought that real life was happening anywhere but Albert Lea. And it wasn't until she started writing that she found that the life that mattered, the life that she really wanted to write about was what she was living all along. It's a little Wizard of Oz, like, there's no place like home. But some of the things, that were challenging to write about, and what I came across with Packing House Daughter, was that Sherry's great-grandfather, Grandpa Ostrander, was the poet and storyteller in her family, and he was provocative. He was the guy who wrote the things for the local newspapers that got the town riled up, because he was always, those people aren't being paid enough, or shouldn't you, be honoring the farmers that need space a lot, need to dig ditches rather than digging ditches for, for the corporation. There was a whole marsh that was drained outside of her homeland, and so he was up in arms about this big corporate project. And what she remembers from him was that he encouraged her to tell disquieting stories. He felt like the disquieting stories are those that really force dialogue. So that was part of, the mission in the classroom, is what are the stories that are disquieting, and why is it so hard for us to penetrate the subject matter? And I keep looking at you, because it's the things about which we feel this irrational emotion, or the emotion that we can't name, but it's there and it's hot, that force us to just be silent and have those cold looks and stares, and we live with that. So I'll tell you a story about a woman I interviewed in a nursing home, and she was 92, and she had grown up in Hayward, and her family raised hogs for Wilson's, and when it came time to, when the strike was happening, Wilson's actively was going out and recruiting farmers, because it was in the farmers' interest that the plant stay open, because they had livestock to sell. And so they thought it was going to be really helpful to keep their plant open if they got farmers on board. Well, in fact, there were those who were desperate enough to have to make that decision to cross the picket line. So this woman, her family decided not to. For whatever reason, they were well off enough, and they weren't going to cross the picket line. But her neighbor was in a different situation, and they did. And she never talked to that woman again. When she was 92, she's in the nursing home, and that woman's old neighbor, who had crossed the picket line, entered the nursing home and was staying just down the hall from her. And the story she tells me of that woman is, well, she's so demented, she doesn't know her left foot from her right, and she deserves it too. So that's the hostility that was repressed and kept for lack of an ability to be able to let it out, to discuss it in reasonable fashion. And I think when they talk about bargaining in good faith, as unions and management are supposed to be able to do, it often gets to the point where there's, the good faith is absent somehow, right? And we discuss some of that in the play. It comes down to what seems like grudge matches between personalities, because we're not equipped with an ability to hear each other in dialogue when emotions get so high. And why are they that high? Because, lives and livelihoods are at stake, and pride in a job well done. And certainly in the plant, In the Wilson's plant, there were people there who highly skilled laborers who, probably had their share of accidents, but were still there by virtue of their ability to work well and hard. And then they're being replaced by people who did not have the skill. And that was an affront. And they had to face that. So what we did in the class, beyond having discussions, the students did research about Albert Lee in the 1950s. And they had working groups. Each class, so there were 3 classes. One class looked at the business community in Albert Lee in the 1950s. Another class looked at the Wilson's plant and how it was structured and what kind of jobs there were and who was doing what jobs. And then the third class actually was the class that would do the reading of the play that I wrote. So they got to do dance workshops in 50s dances, and they got to try on all sorts of costumes. In fact, everyone got to have costumes, because the plan was we were going to take the residency downtown Albert Lee, and have the students present projects about what they had learned to the public. So we created a walking tour of Albert Lee and the Wilson's plant, and then did a reading of the play, very, very first draft of the play in the evening. And the teacher participated in that. And so for him, it was a really new way of teaching history through performance. And for many of those students in the classes, they weren't all theater students. They were just students who were in his classes. And so they got to join in and do some interpretation, which was very new for them. And so then learn the story from the inside. So I'm just going to show you some of the photos from the walking tour. Okay, it's enter. Okay, there's the, how do I turn that? I thought it, all right, well, just everybody turn your head. That's the beginning of the tour. They're not all like that, I promise. Okay, so here's some of the, it was a cold day. And those students had their costumes, but then they wore coats on. And this is, the public hearing her presentation about, I think, the drugstore. These ladies did the Plymouth Shoe Store, and these folks were at the bank, which is downtown. These folks are at the Rivoli Movie Theater, which is now being transformed into an art center, but I understand, it was once an opera house, and the whole plaster ceiling in the Rivoli Theater is still there, but it was impacted because when they renovated it for a mini mall, which was an approach to downtown economy and Albert Lee, the original plaster had to be riddled with holes for the dropped ceiling 4 stories down. So they extended wires from this gorgeous plaster ceiling 4 stories down in order to bolster an economy in the in the 80s. But now there's a group in the Rivoli Theater that's trying to restore it, so that's encouraging. Here we go again. Hardware store, looking a little different than it did in the 50s. Here are the kids on the plant site. So these folks looked at management and were presuming to play the managers of the plants. These guys were butchers on the line, and that poster says the kill. So they looked at what the actual procedures were for killing an animal on the line in the 50s. The clothing that they got came from Select Foods, which is run by a guy that I went to high school with, and was more than happy to let us have the gear to interpret meatpacking, and was rather excited that we were talking about meatpacking with the kids. And Jim Haney, the teacher, actually talked about taking them to tour the plant. So that's a way that the project had, extended beyond writing the play. And these students were managers at the plant discussing healthcare issues, what they learned about it. These young women researched the National Guard coming in, and that's still the choice that the governor made to use the National Guard to close down the plant was not a common one. So often the National Guard is brought in to be able to keep the plant or industry open. And in this case, Orville Freeman, the governor, chose to close down the plant. And that continues to be discussed in labor circles. In fact, a friend and scholar of mine just sent me an article that came out yesterday that was referring to Freeman's choice to use the National Guard in that way. These folks were looking at law enforcement in town because, there was a rift in some of the police force. Many had new people who were working at the plant and were, torn about having to protect, they had which side to protect, as a law enforcement individual. So it was a conflicting time. Farmers, again, I talked a little bit about the role of farmers who were critical in this strike because they did allow the plant to resume operation after it was closed for a couple weeks. And here they are. These were those who were interpreting the picket line, and they researched the issues behind those who chose to be on the picket line. So that was all down. As you can see, there's absolutely nothing there except their cars. And so for a while, what was interesting was that, people were drawn down there just because there was something happening in this vacated space. And many people who had worked at the plant came, and what the students found was, while they were presuming to be experts of sort, because they had researched over weeks to understand these issues, they were really the learners. So you had moments, in fact, some of those first guys are just standing there because there was one man who was like, well, you think you know what you're talking about. Let me tell you a thing or two. And they were thrilled because, their curiosities had been awakened and they were really ready to hear these stories. So it happened up and down the streets that people got to, share their generational stories with young people who are really ready to listen and appreciate. So that was pretty great. So that's all I have of that tour. I do have a video of Sherry talking that I think would be worth sharing. For those of you who are not familiar with Sherry Register's work, so as I said, she wrote Beckinghouse Daughter. She also wrote a book called The Big Marsh, which was about the draining of a marsh outside Hollandale. But also much of the commerce behind it happened here in Austin. So it's a good history that includes Austin, Minnesota, too. She also wrote on chronic illness. She lived her whole life with a disease called Caroli's disease, which was an illness of the liver, and she lived much longer than she ever expected to live, but in fact died just last year. So I was incredibly fortunate to have a year, and what ended up being the last year of her life, to work with her on this project. And so I think it's a nice tribute to be able to hear her talk with students in her own words. And so we will do that in a minute, but I'm totally open to any questions people have. I really would love for you to come and experience the play. It is, when I stage things, I maybe in the poster I put stage in quotation marks, because we're working in a cafeteria. I'm interested in performance happening in non-traditional spaces, and I'm interested in an audience being part of the story, and to the degree that they can and are willing and are interested in participating. So we open up the space in that way, and would love to hear how that works for people. If it's alienating, if it's incorporating, if it feels comfortable. So it would be really helpful for us with this first staging to get some really solid feedback on that. One of the characters in the play says, you know, I'm not afraid to work. This is Sherry's father. We were never afraid to work. And I feel like that, there's a certain parallel there too. We're asking the audience to work with us to really create the experience. And in some cases, as the one fellow here pointed out, in theater, you are making history with every performance, and every second of every performance will never be duplicated because it's all a function of who's there in the room, the text, the climate, the people, the interest, the sound, what myriad factors coming together to create, these one moments. And it is work. Hopefully it's not too exhausting. And hopefully it's work that leaves you feeling charged and energized to tell more local stories. And so we'll go to Sherry, and then we can talk if you want.
Now, here's the old lady all these years later. But there is a continuity in that. And what you will discover for yourselves as you move on through life is that you carry your whole life forward with you. You don't, unless you really make a strong effort to forget or to repress, or something happens to you that takes away your memory, you are still all those people that you once were. And so I feel like I can go back in my memory and I can easily get access to that 18-year-old and to that 14-year-old and still have experiences at this age that will elicit the same emotions I had back then. So I have changed in a lot of ways, but in other ways I haven't changed at all, and there's this thread that just continues to run through this foundation of outlook on life, values, and so on that's always there. And you will find that for yourself as you go forward. So as you're thinking about asking me questions, or answering questions I might ask you, or making comments, you're not just talking to an old lady. You're talking to the character in the book. You're talking to the elderly teenager. All of those people are here in this room. And when I come back to Albert Lee, even though outwardly things changed very much, like this doesn't look at all in my school, places that were very dear to me have gone missing, I still see the layers of everything that used to be here. So I know where I am. I can orient myself despite the changes because I know what this used to be. And I mean, just yesterday I drove by, I was surprised to see the houses of a childhood friend and my high school boyfriend were still standing. I thought those would probably be gone, but no, they're there. But all of that becomes layered over time. And the more I learn about this place, doing historical research about it, the more layers I add, so that even things I didn't experience myself are part of that life that I carry forward, and that sense of the place that I come from. It includes, the dead people, the people in the graves at Graceland Cemetery where I used to play when I was a kid. They've been there for a long time. The previous 5 generations of my family. It's all part of a whole that I see as, ironically, my literary imagination. When I was a teenager here, my first impulse was to get out of here. I couldn't imagine that I would spend the rest of my life in a place like this. I really had a strong motive to escape and go to where real life was happening. To go to New York City, for example, which was the center of the universe, where I could be part of the life that I saw on TV, the life that was portrayed in movies, the life that was written about in books. I could get out of just this little slew of ordinariness and boredom, get onto that big life out there. And then I got to this point in my life, maybe like 20 or 30 years ago, and realized that when I started trying to interpret the meanings of life, try to write stories about it, everything comes from Brevard County. That all along, this was where life was really happening. And I didn't realize that until I became a writer, really.
So, does anybody have any questions? Is anybody writing anything they want to talk about? Great.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How long has this project taken you from start to this point?
Okay, so it depends on what you consider the start. But when I got the idea to do a residency, that would have been 2016. So to write a grant application takes time and collaboration. So that grant was awarded the end of 2016, and then I could start the residency process was January through May. And then, since then, I've taken the text, so that was a first draft of the text. I've done 5 different public readings and revised according to those readings. And then now we're staging. Now we're putting it on its feet. If I wrote more traditionally, it might have been produced sooner. But if you come, you'll see it's what we call object theater as much as it is, living room theater. It's like a combination of both. So you have the family story, but you also have the world of the plant that we explore. And it's historical, and there's a lot of history there that fascinates me. But staging history can be really dry, right? So animating some of that the exposition and the background, the why of the story, was an interesting task. So I chose some different devices for doing that. And they really relied on bodies and objects. They don't translate on the page. So that's part of why, staging it has taken some time. And it also, it's just producing one's own work, it's a function of grant writing, raising funds, finding the venue, that's just. But honestly, I had a friend who produces a lot in Minneapolis. He says, well, just bring it up to the city and we'll get it done. And I find myself bristling at that because I want us to be able to produce the works that tell our stories movingly and powerfully in our own spaces. We don't have to go to the city for it to be legitimate, right? Our stories are legitimate and they're validated further by being here among the people who can, and I can say who can relate. Well, anybody can relate to these stories because there's a lot of passion and just basic human purpose behind Sherry's stories. That said, the territory that she covers is very much home for us. And any time that you see your home reflected on stage or explored, there is a way in that's more custom made for you than for potentially anybody else. I will say I made choices in casting the play. I wrote the play that were not able to be honored here in the school because I wanted a multiracial cast because the field of meatpacking is so thoroughly multiracial. We would not have a meatpacking industry if you did not have, the play refers to the black fellows on the kill line in Chicago, but all of meatpacking in the South, and then Mexican Americans have thoroughly built the industry in the Midwest, and so the play is intended to be more represented, multiracially represented, but the theater department here, is not so racially diverse. And so that's an interesting question as a theater artist. How do we make space for more people to tell their stories on our stages? And some of that has to do with economy. There's a certain leisure, associated with an ability to be a performer, right, or to be a storyteller. And it's cost prohibitive in many cases, because it doesn't pay, right? So you have to be able to make some sacrifices and able to access that art form that not everybody is able to make. And so that's a problem. That's a problem I think we should continue to discuss. How to make space for more people on our stages, or make more stages where there are more people. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Well, it's 1 o'clock. I really thank you for being here, and I look forward to seeing you.